Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Tom, for a good lead-in as well. I was a bit worried that we might overlap, but in practice, I think you set the scene admirably, because I'm going to home in on one very particular aspect of today's subject, which is tax increment finance, which we'll come on to in a moment. I just wanted to explain why me, Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, is actually interested in infrastructure, because you may think that, I represent a whole gang of developers, which I'm sure you all have contact with, who you may think are there just to, put it up quickly, get the money and run. Well, far from it. I mean, the membership I represent, and I won't beat about the bush, I probably have the good end of the market, not the sort of rogue developers who might be doing what I've just outlined earlier. I actually represent a lot of companies who are investing in real estate, in development and holding real estate for the long term. And if you want decent real estate, and the whole point about property and real estate is it needs to make an income. It's no good as an asset class if it's not got people in it who are paying you rent. If you want it to make an income and be successful, it needs to be properly served by infrastructure. So infrastructure, provision of all different sorts of infrastructure is absolutely key for the property industry being able to do the things it wants to do in order to make money. So we have been very focused, for as long as I've been doing this job, for the last 8.5 years, we've been extremely focused on how we actually encourage governments and other agencies to invest in the sort of infrastructure that's needed if you want to do the sort of development that we actually believe society requires, and that, by the way, my members would like to do to make money. But hell, there's no problem in making money. We wouldn't have business if we wouldn't have an economy if they didn't. So one of the things that we've been trying to do for a long time is encourage the Treasury, in particular communities and local government in its various incarnations, to think about new ways of funding infrastructure. I mean, as Tom says, there are some very, very big challenges out there. Those were huge numbers that we were talking about. We don't believe that the conventional way of looking at the funding of infrastructure is going to work. We have got to think imaginatively and think creatively. The idea of this thing called a tax increment finance mechanism is not new. Been around for a long time. There'd been umpteen reports talking about it even before I started campaigning for it 8 years ago, largely based on what has actually happened in America. Now, by the way, TIFs, and there's a lot of different sort of terms you can use here. You can talk about tax increment financing. You'll also hear people talk about accelerated development zones, which are sort of roughly the same thing. You'll also hear people talk about local tax, I'm going to even remember this one, local tax reinvestment programs, or LTRIPs. But don't people just love inventing acronyms anyway? For the purposes of simplicity today, and so that I don't get confused, I'm going to talk about the TIF mechanism, tax increment financing. And don't worry, I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment. There's a lot of sort of literature being built up around the TIF model and how and why it could be useful. And on the one hand, in this literature, of course, there's pros and cons. On the one hand, a fabulous tool that must be used carefully. On the other, overused, inappropriately used, and leading to diminishing returns to taxpayers, both by sort of relatively respectable academics. But, yes, it's better. Why do we think a TIF is important? Well, as Tom has already hinted, we have a massive not hinted, even stated, we have a massive problem of resource constraint. We are going to see cuts in public expenditure, absolutely, definitely, over the next few years, whichever party wins on the 6th of May. We simply cannot expect the level of public sector funding that we have had in the past. We have the massive infrastructure deficit. I won't say any more about that because I think Tom outlined that absolutely brilliantly. From my members' perspective, we're seeing regeneration largely stalled. A lot of big companies in the UK want to be out there doing regeneration. They want to rebuild, perhaps not the centres of the major cities. I think we've done quite well in a lot of those, but there are now a whole raft of what I call sort of, even Championship and League Division 1 cities that need an awful lot of work. And I'm not just talking about brassy new shopping centres. This is about a much more fundamental redevelopment and rebuilding, which I think is essential if we want to rebuild some of the social structures that we have had in the UK and which I think are breaking down. And of course, if we're going to get into this sort of putting regeneration back at the top of the agenda, we have to look for new money. We have to look at new ways of actually dealing with this. One perhaps point I should mention, which I didn't put on this slide, of course, the traditional way of dealing with infrastructure has been to get the developer to pay. And I'm sure a number of you will be, I'm not sure how many of you are from planning departments in local authorities, but you'll be familiar with this wonderful thing called a Section 106 agreement. Comes from whichever planning act it was. Somebody will probably help me there, an old one, 19 something or other, which basically says if a developer is doing a development, then he should also pay to mitigating the effects of that development. Seems a fair enough proposition. So if you're putting a spanking new development and it puts extra pressure on the local transport infrastructure, you get the developer to pay for a new roundabout, a new bridge, a new access onto the motorway, or whatever. The problem is Section 106 is used intermittently, used badly. It's departed from its sort of previous definitions. It's stretched the legislative framework. It's a slightly dodgy legislative position now, as a result of which the government has introduced or is about to introduce this thing called Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL, as we like to call it for short. Predicated on the basis that every local authority will be able to levy the development industry for a contribution to local infrastructure. Fine if the development community's got the money. But the development community has also got to pay for increasing sustainability in its buildings. It has got to pay for improved energy efficiency. House builders have to pay for affordable housing. Throw in about 25 other demands, as detailed in the London Plan, including public art. And the development community say, well, fine, but which one would you like us to pay for? We can't actually pay for everything. So new money is important. Developers should pay. They should pay their share, but they won't be able to pay the £434 billion that Policy Exchange actually think is necessary. They won't even be able to pay a major portion of that. They can make a contribution. So the need for new money is hugely important. Now, forgive me if I'm teaching some of you to suck eggs. Quick lesson in what a TIF actually is. And I'll do this because I was at a government group meeting a little while back. Several people there said, what is a TIF? So I thought we'd better go back to the beginning. Basically, I've even got a pointer here, so see if I can make this work. You will have an infrastructure requirement. Let's say it's for a new road to support a big new housing development, 5,000 new homes going into Little Wallop or something like that. You actually need a new road structure to go with it. Now, there are various ways in which you could actually do that. You could, and we'll focus on this box for the moment, the local authority might actually borrow. Local authorities can borrow, prudent borrowing, and they'd almost certainly use the Public Works Loan Board. Okay? Then, so the development happens. We have a development which leads to enhanced business rates being paid. Actually, that was a bad example that I started with. Let's talk about businesses for the moment. Let's assume it's a road that's going to support a new shopping centre or a new trading estate. So we're going to get lots of businesses. We're going to put the infrastructure in. The development's going to happen. That's actually going to lead to that trading estate contributing much bigger business rates than were paid previously. So basically, you hypothecate. That's a term you're probably all familiar with, especially those in local government. You put a ring fence around the additional business rate and you use that to repay the debt you've taken up here. So it's a nice simple loop. You have an infrastructure requirement to support a development. You get hold of the finance to do it. You do it. You do your development. You contribute enhanced business rate and you repay that debt that you've incurred up here. And the models that we've been looking at, you could take up to 30 years to do that. You could set any time frame. The interesting box in all this is whether and how you actually do it through public debt. There are lots of different ways of doing it. You could, for example, let's just change that box. You could do it through bonds, and they could either be public or private sector bonds, or, particularly interesting one, you could actually get the developers to do it. I'm going to talk about some specific examples in a moment. And a number of the development community are so keen on this and so think this is the right answer that they are actually saying, forget the public debt or the public bonds. We will actually go out and find the finance in the capital markets. All we ask, all the developer wants to know, is that the local authority will be allowed to ring-fence the enhanced business rate to pay back in due course, pay interest at first and pay back the principal in due course. And what the developers are even saying is, we will take the risk that this isn't big enough.